Hi everyone, it's Anne. Thanks for joining me on Art on the Creek. I'm talking to you from my home studio in Parker, Colorado, and I'm so happy to share these pictures with you. I really hope you enjoy them. We're going to use them for our inspiration today. I know that I have painted a lot of scenes like this, but this is my home. This is where I live, and boy, I just can't get enough of them. So I hope you enjoy doing this too. The pictures you're seeing now are of Roxborough State Park, and I have a wonderful image to inspire us, and I'll talk about the trip we took there just last week. So are you ready? Let's get started. Let's see what we can paint today. Here's the photo I took that I want to use as our inspiration today. Now, what I'm going to paint is not really going to look like this at all. It is just going to be an inspiration. So keep that in mind. I just really wanted to have some fun painting rock faces, but if you want to go ahead and go for more of a likeness, certainly go ahead. You may download that photo and do whatever you wish with it. These are the paints I'm going to use today. They are my Mijello Mission Gold Pure Pigment set, and I'll link to everything in the description. I have this great palette. It's got that whole panel there pulls out, and the part where the paints are pulls out as well, so you have 3 huge mixing wells to use. I have a couple of these palettes. I really like it. But what I'm going to do is I just want to show you a really fun way to get started when you're painting rocks, where you really don't have to make a drawing at all. In fact, you can use your palette mud, I like to call it, to make a beautiful palette gray or a palette natural color, just going from what you had in your palette already. Now I am adding just a touch of Van Dyke brown and red brown to this. And that little pile of gray over there on the lower left-hand side is ultramarine blue and Van Dyke brown. So I'm just kind of adding a little bit here and there, just kind of trying to refresh my memory there, looking at the card to see what's on the palette. And now I want to add some of the red. I'm going to go ahead and add in some of that permanent red deep because these rocks do have such a prominent pinkish red tone to them. And I'm kind of just placing this mottler brush. Really, at this point, I'm just trying to establish basic shapes and shades and to try and get a sense of how these rocks are angled. Now I've added some green gold up there, and I'm trying to get more of the sunlight into this middle section here. And like I said, I'm not trying to replicate the reference photo at all. I'm just showing you a way to paint rocks that you can use a mottler brush or some other flat brush or a stroke brush to get in here and really get the brush and the way that it moves to really work for you. I'm using those gray tones to kind of establish where I want to put the shadows. At this point, I'm using very thin washes, and I'm just kind of trying to go in and just establish where I want to be a little more red, where I want it to be a little more gold, and so on, and where I want these shadows to be. So I'm just laying down these shapes and letting the paint flow. I'm going wet into wet. Right now, this section right here is wet on dry, but I will come back and go over it. And it'll be wet into wet, wet into damp. I really want to let the pigments play and mix. And I'm just going to add some more red to this and mix it in with that gray down there just to get a good deep reddish brown. And I'll fill that in. These rocks are part of the fountain formation. I've talked about them before here in Colorado, in my part of the world. And gosh, let's see, it extends all the way up through Boulder and Lyons. And, you'll have to look on a map. But it does go for miles and miles. It goes all the way down through Garden of the Gods, Colorado Springs. Those are all part of the same geological that happened, that happened, and when the earth was being formed. And I am fascinated with rocks. You guys are probably going to think I'm nuts, but I think rocks are almost more beautiful than lakes or animals, or I just think it's so fun to be able to witness this and to know that at one point all of these rocks were flat. And there was a big cleft in the earth and it pushed them up, which is why you have this great slanty look to them, because they are sedimentary rocks. All of that sediment just pressed down and formed the rock, and then an earthquake came and pushed it all up along this ridge. And it's a very long ridge. It doesn't crop up all the time, but There are some beautiful, fascinating spires of rocks and other geological formations here in Colorado, and I'm sure in many, many states. But this particular type of rock is very close to my house, and it's about the same elevation that we are, and you really feel like you're in the mountains per se, but we're right about 6,200 feet. It's not too high up. But yeah, it's just so fun to be able to access this and just to see it and think about what was it like when the Native Americans were roaming this place for the first time, and then they saw these rocks. I mean, what did they think? They must have thought that it was just something so powerful and magical because, I don't know, creation is beautiful. Let's go on here with the greens that I'm putting in. I am chiefly using that green gold, which is a PY150, and I'm also using a cobalt green. That one's a PB28. I really want to get a lot of liquid in here and a lot of granulation happening. Now I'm going to mix more of this gray for the sky. The skies this day were really fabulous. And again, this is a mix of the ultramarine, which is a PB29, with that Van Dyke brown, which is a PBR7. I typically mix burnt sienna and ultramarine to make a gray, but here I've got it leaning a little more towards the blue, you can see. But I wanted to use their Van Dyke brown because it's not as red. This particular set, if you mix the PB29 with the red brown, you will end up getting kind of more of a deep purple, and we will do that as time goes on this. But for now, for the sky, what I'm doing is just placing the pigment down and then coming in with a wet brush and kind of giving it a path to travel on. I'm really not thinking too hard. I'm just basically trying to get some dark areas in there to where the pigment will separate and it will look like clouds churning and moving through the sky. So again, all of this painting that I'm doing, none of it, I should say, none of the painting that I'm doing today is going to be an exact replica of what's in the picture. This is just a very expressive, very loose way to paint mountains and skies, scenery, landscapes, any of this. You can translate this technique to just about anything. And now I'm going to go in and turn up the chroma a little bit on this because remember, watercolor dries with a big color shift. So I want to go in and really kind of get these base colors established. Now this will end up being pretty much hidden in the painting when it's done, but we can go back and lift some of it off, which I will do, and reveal some more of this this pinkish red. The red that I'm using, the PR254, they have it listed in this set as a permanent red deep. Just about everywhere else you will look, it will be listed as a pyrrole red, and it can shift slightly toward purple. A lot of people like using pyrrole red for a neutral red. So I think where it lies in this particular palette, it's leading me to believe it's a little bit more cool than warm. But now we kind of have just this situation of color play, and you can see the granulation coming out here in the sky and down here on the grass. The paper that I'm using, unfortunately, this particular sketchbook is no longer available, but you can use any paper that's got a decent texture on it will help with your granulating techniques. And I've got quite a bit of water on here. This particular paper is 100% cotton, which I do recommend with this. If you're doing anything with a lot of water, I do recommend using the 100% cotton. Let me zoom in here and you can see how this granulation is starting to look and show up on the paper. It really is coming through nicely, and I really like how the reds and yellows of the mountain are dripping down into the greenery. Everything's just kind of getting married together nicely. So now I'm just going to let this dry. I'll just tip it around and play with it a little bit longer, but then we're going to just let it dry naturally and let that pigment do its magic. So in just a moment, we'll be back. And just like that, with the magic of television, here it is all dry. I really kind of like what's going on here. You can see we've got lots of granulation happening. We've got lots of a good basis for us to grow from and really make this into a fun painting. I like the way the sky turned out. I like the way that the clouds are moving and swirling all up in the sky, and the mountain base looks really good, and I'm pleased with what we've got going for the green. So let's get started making some detail. So let's start working on the rock face. I've got some green gold here, and I think I've mixed that with a little bit of that red brown. Yeah, let's put some of that in there. So that's a PBR 25 mixed with a PY 150. If you don't have those pigments, you can certainly use burnt sienna. that would be a great one. I'm trying to stick with ones that will granulate a little bit because I really like what that does with the rock. And the brush that I'm using is a Trekell Protege. It's a synthetic Kalinsky sable, and it's got a very tapered belly to it. It's kind of a long round. I'm trying to find my other round to give you a comparison, but of course it's never within reach when I need it, my other number 6. But at any rate, this round is very good for what I want to do because I'm working in a really small area. This painting is just 8 inches by 8 inches. And I just want to be able to have the capacity to make fine lines and broad strokes. And this brush is really good for that. I really like it. So let's go in here with that kind of a burnt sienna mix. And I'm going to try and replicate the shadows that we're seeing in that inspirational photo that I took. But we're not really going to do exactly what we see. So for instance, to me it looks like 3 or 4 rocks that are kind of connected here. So let's go ahead and just kind of create some clefts and shadows, get the basic angles down. And I'm going to use a little bit of sideways strokes here on my brush. It's not quite dry brush technique, but I am going very lightly. I'm just trying to get a good transparent wash over what I've got down there already. That's one thing that is really great about using watercolors, where you can get the information. Now this particular set has full information on light fastness, transparency, opacity, so you can see if the paint that you're using is going to be transparent or semi-opaque, or if it's going to be staining or non-staining, and how light fast it is. So these are all really good bits of information for me as I decided what pigments to use to paint these rocks. And I would encourage you to find as much about your paints as you can when you're trying to paint something, because it really does help you. So you can see again there, I'm bouncing around here in my voiceover, sorry, but that's how I'm holding the brushes, just between my finger and my forefinger and my thumb. Just really have very loose control over it. And I'm kind of holding onto it at the widest portion of the handle there. And I'm just letting that brush drag across the surface of the paper. I'm not really doing a dry brush technique like I mentioned, because I've got too much paint on there, and my brush itself, the belly, is just a little bit too wet for that purpose. But I'm letting the angle of the rock and my hand, the way that I'm holding it, really dictate where these lines go. I'm intentionally not painting with an awful lot of control. And what I'm doing first here is I'm going to put in the darkest shadows. So let me get those in, and then we'll skip ahead to the next portion. I've continued that same process across the entire rock face, and now I'm going in with a little bit more of the red. I've got just a bit more of that permanent red in here, and I'm just adding some of that warmth back in. I want to try and keep that gold at the top of the rocks kind of visible, but I did end up covering it up, and I'll show you how to fix that in case that happens to you. The mix that I've got there and kind of in the center of my palette is the ultramarine and that red-brown. So here you can see it created right here. There's the red-brown going in with a little bit of ultramarine. If you don't have this combination, I would go with a neutral tint, particularly M-Gram. M-Gram's neutral tint, to me, lends a little bit purple. So I really enjoy using that purple base, a deep, deep purple for shadows. If you wanted to go ahead and use the dioxazine violet, you could. Just make sure you're using some kind of a cool purple. I think a quinacridone violet would be too warm, but dioxazine violet would work very, very well for you there. So we're just, again, going through and creating various fissures in the rocks, just in general indicating their shape and that they are jutting out of the earth at an angle. And now it's time to think a little bit about the green. I love this cobalt green that's in here. It is a PB28, and I'm just going to mix it in with whatever I've got here on my palette. Whenever you do that, whenever you take a new color and add it into whatever you've got on your palette, it will help unify your painting and bring all of the colors together. Because when we look at this in real life, we do see the green of the trees and the red of the rock, but we're seeing that light bounce back to us. We're seeing the light bounce off the red of the rock through those trees back to our eye. So you want to be able to keep all of that beauty of nature kind of married on your palette when you're painting. So that's why I like to whenever I introduce a new color, I'll mix it with whatever I've got going on my palette just a little bit, just to make sure that I can pick up some of the natural surroundings in that, because this is going to be very loose, very rough, like I said, and we're not going to paint detailed trees in front of these rocks. I'm just going to establish that these rocks are surrounded by greenery. I can tell you what the greenery is. It's scrub oak, and it's quite abundant this time of year. It's a food that the deer really love to eat, and the elk, and there's quite a bit of those critters roaming around in our area and over in the park. So they also have in that area a lot of bighorn sheep, which is our state mammal. So there's quite a lot of quite a lot of animals that rely on the scrub oak, and it's just so lush and beautiful right now. Like I said, this is really unusual for this time of year in Colorado, but we've had such a very wet spring. And now what I'm mixing is that green gold in with the cobalt, and this is where I like to have fun. I've already got a little bit of that cobalt down to establish the dark shadows of the greens. But now I'm going to go into that wet paint with just the green gold on my brush and let it mix on the paper. I think this is one of the best ways to create dimension in your work, is to let your paints do what they want to do naturally. That's like the one thing that I had to learn the most when I was working with watercolor, is to give up, really, to just surrender to the paint and let it do what it wants to do. Watercolor wants to go where there is water. So if you create a path for it, it will continue to flow. If you don't want it to flow, you can definitely dry that area with a heat tool, or be very precise and let it dry and not touch it. Watercolor does have a mind of its own. It wants to travel. It wants to do the things that it wants to do. It wants to leave a path where it's been. It wants to show you its various pigments and how they settle into the nooks and crannies. It's a beautiful, beautiful medium. And I think if you let it do what it wants to do, you will end up being happier with it, because it really can be quite a struggle. So I've got that cobalt green, and I'm still mixing it in with various things on my palette and adding in some of the yellow. I'm calling it yellow, but really it's a green gold. It's a yellow pigment, but it does read kind of greenish. And I love using it for sunlight on greenery, because it's got enough of a green element in it that it can be perceived as almost a spring green, and or when light is really shining on leaves and that translucency comes through of the yellow reflecting back to you. I really like using that green gold for this purpose, so I wanted to be sure and put that in the foreground. And then as we get closer to the edge of the paper, and I'm just creating a really organic edge here, I'm going to focus a little bit more on that cobalt to get that a little bit darker and cooler right in front of us. I'm trying to suggest that the sun is coming down and just through the clouds and spotlighting on that mountain. That's really the image that I'm trying to create here. And I think it worked out pretty well. You guys will have to decide what it is that you want to convey in your painting and focus on that. Right now, I'm just really kind of trying to create a unique light source. So let me scoot ahead a little bit to where we put some salt down, and then we'll see what we can do with that. When you put salt on wet watercolor, the water and the pigment will leach into the salt. Salt likes water, and water likes salt. So again, this is one of the things that you're letting this, you combine these recipes of water, paint, salt, and thyme, and you can end up with some really unique things going on in your painting. Just real parenthetically there, I don't know if the clip covered it or not, but that white spot or the lighter spot on the peak of the mountain jutting out there, the rocks, that is dropped some water on my rocks there, and I just blotted it off, but we'll be able to fix that. I want to show you these crystals. They're really unique. This is a salt that I picked up, another artist recommended it to me, and I'm sorry I don't remember who, but it's really unique. I'm going to try and show you this with a tweezer, but I'm pretty sure that it's not quite that stable, and I think, yeah, it's going to break. At any rate, though, the little crystals in here are large. I mean, that little pyramid was probably a 1/4 inch across at its base. Now, you do not have to get this kind of salt, but I do encourage you to experiment with different kinds of salt. Try regular table salt, just the iodized salt that you get for a regular salt shaker. Here you can see I was able to pick up another one of these crystals, and you can see how unique they are. They really do look like little pyramids. I've found that different salts will give you slightly different effects. It's not drastic though, so you can use whatever kind of salt you want. Like I said, you can use the regular table salt. You can use this largely flaked salt, large crystals, or you can use kosher salt. You can get Himalayan flaked salt. There's black salt, pink salt, any of them. You just try any salt you want to, any salt you get your hands on. You can even play around and use different kinds of salt. But it is a technique that I really recommend that you try, and it works very well. And then you see I dropped my brush right in the sky. Luckily, there was an eagle flying overhead that day, so I'm going to go ahead and add him in rather than try and lift that off. So I will show you how to do that toward the end, and in the next clip, we'll take the salt off, and then we'll work on the final details of our rock face. Now I have let this sit long enough for me to go upstairs and clean up the kitchen a little bit. I like where it's at right now with the salt, so I think what I'm going to do is use my heat tool on this to go ahead and let it stop doing what it's doing. If I were to let it continue, then of course more pigment would leach in, and it's just right about the right amount of texture now. On the ridge left behind the rock, I went ahead and added in a tree line, and then I threw in some more trees on the right as well, and that's just with that cobalt green combined with some of the darker areas on my palette. And after we've got this dry, I'm going to go in and we'll lift off some of that rock face to kind of enhance that light shining on the rock. So we'll get there next. Some of that salt didn't want to come off, but I was able to get it all, and I really like the way that turned out. So you can see with the different pigments on there, and in that foreground, it's just the cobalt blue, the cobalt green, and that green gold. That's all I've got in the foreground. And look at how great that salt helped those colors to divide and conquer. And now I've got a wonderfully textured foreground and a little bit more texture in the background, and I don't have to worry about a thing. So now I'm going in with just some water, because this is where I feel like the rocks needed a little bit more of that gold brought back into it. I got to the point on this where I almost overworked it, and I'm going to show you what to do in case you end up in this predicament as well. So this is another reason why I like really layering the watercolors, because when I'm putting this water on top, of course, the pigments that it's going to lift are the ones that are closest to the surface. So remember when we first went in and we did those rocks, I had a lot of gold laying down, and I had some good areas of red laying down. Now there on the right, I ended up taking off quite a bit because I wanted to go in and redo some of that. I wasn't pleased with that corner over there. But at any rate, when I laid down those original pigments and then added on top of them, then you can just put a little bit of water on after it's dry if you're not happy with it, and then just lift it off, and you can put back in whatever it is that you like. And that is why I really like using these transparent pigments. Now, in the colors that I used, not all of them are completely transparent. Some of them are semi-transparent, and some of them are staining, some are non-staining. But for the most part, I think I used transparent. Yes, I'm looking at the pigment, or the swatch chart that I made, and the only one that's referenced here as semi-transparent or semi-opaque rather, is the cobalt green. So that's in the foreground, and you can probably tell the difference between how luminescent those rocks are compared to that cool green in the foreground. That's another way for you to recognize a color as being semi-opaque or transparent. But again, those transparent layers will really help you achieve many, many things in watercolor. I really feel that it's really important to look at the transparency or opacity of your colors. And, opacity is something that is great too, just to have an awareness of knowing which paints you're using and what you're trying to achieve with that particular pigment. So I'm going back in here now and just adding some random shadows, random clefts in the rock. The colors that I'm using to do this are the red-brown mixed with that ultramarine light. And again, the substitution for this would be some kind of a neutral tint or a gray that you've mixed. And just kind of really getting those clefts and shadows back in there, keeping the darkness over to the left underside of the rocks. And what I was trying to achieve here was the rocks and the area right in front of them under spotlight, in addition to that far off hillside in the back in the left. There were so many pockets of sunshine coming through on the clouds this day that I really wanted to try and capture this varying light. And I'm pretty happy with the way that this came out for a very loose, very abstract, very unique way to approach these clouds. Like I said, if you wanted to do something much more realistic, you certainly could. For the shadows, I would recommend that you do focus on some of the purples because they really do make a beautiful, cool shadow. So like I said, the dioxazine purple would be a good one to use. If you're mixing your grays, use a blue and a brown to get a good gray mix to where you can actually bring out the coolness to your shadows. Because once again, when you're mixing those colors on your palette, you can really take advantage of all of the colors that you've used and watch them mix and play together. And I really hope that you guys have enjoyed this painting of a rock outcropping in Roxborough State Park. And I really hope you get out into the world wherever you are. And gosh, even if it's just your own backyard, try and capture the light and shadow of what it is that you're looking at. Try and do some unique ways of making that happen. Here I've used some green gold, some warmth of that tone, and the cool of the cobalt, and the cool of that underlying shadows on the rocks to try and establish where that light and shadow rests on our landscape. And if you drop your paintbrush, you can always turn it into a bird. Take care, you guys. I hope you had a wonderful time with this. I know I had so much fun sharing it with you, and I hope you do get a chance to play with some light and shadow on your next painting. Take care, everybody. Bye now.